Okay, so Sue, I'm going to move over to your slides now. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So hello everybody and welcome to the meeting, and thanks so much for everybody's time this morning. I'm Sue Critchley from the Innovation Agency, and we are the Academic Health Science Network for the North West Coast. This is the alternative approach to the planned face-to-face session that we were expecting to deliver today, although video conferencing is fast becoming the new normal. The only certainty we currently have is that this is an unprecedented situation, and that having some online space to talk about high sensitivity troponins is COVID responsive and an assertive and positive way to absorb the imminent pressures that we face. We can also be sure that this work is identified by NHS England as a high priority improvement project for continued focus and keeping forwards momentum that gets our patients safely out of the emergency department, avoiding admission and unnecessary monitoring, and releases resource for those patients that need it the most. So moving on, we're really delighted that Professor Rick Boddy, Professor Paul Collinson and Dr. Aleem have made themselves available around their various pressures today to speak, share their experiences and research data. And this is set to be a really high quality discussion. So Professors Boddy and Collinson are national clinical leads for this project, ambassadors and advisors for this work, and Dr. Cand is taking the clinical lead role for our region. So this Zoom is recorded and can be shared with colleagues afterwards. We're going to give 5 short presentations today, and I'll start off with a background to the project. Next slide, please, Carla. So this is a project funded by the Accelerated Access Collaborative and delivered by the 15 academic health science networks that cover the NHS in England. And the Innovation Agency are seen at number 1 on this map. And we are the lead AHSN for this project nationally, which means that we shape the project delivery method with a working group that includes industry, NICE and NHSE, I and X. At number 2 on this map is Greater Manchester Academic Health Science Network, who support Professor Boddy's acute coronary syndromes work in Manchester. And just as a point to make here, that AHSNs are industry agnostic. We do not sell or gain commercially and do not have any targets for selling products. We're commissioned by NHSE, INX and the Office for Life Science, and our primary aim is to support the system to adopt innovation. Next slide, please, Colin. So we work closely with the Accelerated Access Collaborative. The AAC supports all types of innovations, medicines, diagnostics, devices, digital products, pathway changes, and new workforce models. There are early stage products that are new, potentially highly effective products which need support through regulatory and approvals processes, and there are late stage products to fast track and boost uptake of appropriately evidence-based products. Next slide, please. So with the NICE guidance DG15 and CG95, high sensitivity troponin lies in the late stage rapid uptake product category for fast track and boost. Next slide, please. So what are the overall aims of this project? Well, this is to reduce unnecessary time to discharge by increasing the number of patients receiving high sensitivity troponin tests within NICE recommendations, using recommended assays and a recommended rapid rule-out pathway. And the suggested target is to aim between 40 to 60%, and that's in line with the new sequin targets for 2021. Next slide, please. Thank you. You'll notice that the project aim refers to working to achieve the NICE DG15 recommendations, and they are currently under review. And this review has also been identified as high priority and COVID responsive by the NICE team. and the revised guidelines that were expected in August this year will now be given more resource. So currently there are only 2 troponin assays that are recommended as high sensitivity assays by NICE, the Roche Alexis Troponin T and the Abbott Architecture Troponin I assays, but this picture may change, and that may be sooner than August. So we recommend that you, back a slide please, Carla. Thank you. We recommend you collaborate with each other as trusts and learn from each other's mistakes and successes and provide support to each other. And because of the myriad of barriers in any situation, regardless of the situation we're in now, there are many barriers in the clinical setting, and they span multi-professional teams. There are several support methods already in place to help achieve the aim. So this includes local executive support, local and regional medical director backing, and input from QI teams, and also, of course, a collective commitment from the teams to achieving the guidelines. There is a comprehensive NICE adoption toolkit with shared learning examples, pathway examples, and overview of the implementation process. And you'll hear from the Innovation Agency Coaching Academy later. There's also support available from Roche Diagnostics, who have vast experience in supporting change processes in line with the project aims. Next slide, please. There are also a number of freely available quality improvement tools that we can work with you on as teams at your individual sites, especially if you're unfamiliar with the validated improvement methods. Next slide, please. So just as background, there have been 4 funding routes towards this project. The Innovation Technology Payment and the Shared Learning Collaborative are funding routes for sites that are beginning to implement NICE approved pathways. The Pathway Transformation Fund supports sites who are embedding or developing pathways, and we have been granted funds in that category in the Pathway Transformation Fund. And we were funded to set up an improvements collaborative. So all those monies go to the lead trust and stay there. The clinical lead is Dr. Cand, and he is appointed from the lead trust, who will facilitate learning and improvement at each of the NICE approved sites. So in our geography, they will be Roche sites. We don't have any Abbott sites. So the non-Roche sites won't get direct time support clinically, but are invited and encouraged to join in with this collaborative and will benefit from attending. And then hopefully we'll be able to secure further money later on in the year if they convert or become eligible as a NICE compliant site later on in the year.
Okay.
Sequin.
Sorry, Sue, just time, to be conscious of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Nearly there, Carla. Sequin's also available from this April with an level for achieving 60% of patients with suspected myocardial infarction, seen within a rapid rule-out pathway. And next slide is a summary of the Sequin indicators with quarterly reporting requirements. And the Sequin guidance highlights for testing to be carried out in line with NICE recommendations, and it's applicable to all type 1 emergency departments. And next slide, please, Carla. And this is an overview of the minimum reporting requirements for our funding route. So there are 5 data fields to be collected monthly, and the first submission should include the previous year's numbers as a baseline to be used as comparison. We'll guide you through all of that when you're ready to collect data. Next slide, please. And here's an overview of the reporting requirements for Sequin, which are in broad alignment with the previous reporting data set. And final slide, please. And this is just, hopefully it's a helpful summary to see both the reporting measures next to each other. And when reporting comes round, we just ask that all submissions are sent into the Innovation Agency as well, please. Thank you, that's all from me. So
Lovely,
now,
thanks. So I just would like to say as well, we've got some new people that have just joined us. If you have got any questions, type them in the Q&A. If you've got any technical difficulties, type them into the chat. Everything is going to be recorded. If you've missed the first start of it, don't worry, it will be online. And now we're going to move to Paul Collinson. Paul, would you like me to start your slides, or are you happy to do it?
I will try my technology. How about
Lovely, thank you very much, Paul.
that? Right. Oops. Right. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This presentation actually is only taking place courtesy of COVID, because I was supposed to be in the Maldives today. Sadly, I am not. Right. I always like to start with a diving picture. This is a great white shark. Right. What is high sensitivity troponin? I'm often asked this, and I say, well, actually, it's because we measure it with love, and so we're very sensitive about it. In fact, high sensitivity assay, it's a technical description of a quality rather than it being something special. And those of you who've been around the whole concept of troponin measurement for a long time will know that we started with assays that were relatively insensitive, and we have progressively moved them. So what we're looking at with shift to high sensitivity assay, it's merely the latest step in progressive improvement in assay quality. And what this effectively means is that we can now measure troponin down to very, very low levels. And in fact, we can measure troponin in normal healthy individuals, which we were not able to do before. And in technical speak, this means that the limit of blank, which is the lower limit of the assay, and the limit of detection are now very, very low. Typically, if we take, for example, the Roche troponin T assay, we used to only effectively be able to measure down to about 30 to 40 nanograms per litre. Now we can measure down to 3. The fact that an assay is high sensitivity doesn't mean anything different. We're talking about the analytical characteristics of the assay. We're not measuring a different form of troponin, which some people seem to think. So this means that, in fact, the literature from previous work on troponins is entirely transferable forward. All that it means is that assays are measurable down to much lower level, and so things like release kinetics, previous studies are all entirely valid. The definition of a high sensitivity troponin assay is that the total imprecision, that's the imprecision for those of you who are not technically minded, is the ability to repeatedly measure troponin and get essentially the same answer. That should be less than 10%. The reality is that the imprecision of these assays now is typically around 2 to 3%. It should also detect about at least 50% of healthy individuals above the limit of detection of the assay, and the prerequisite is that these results should be reported in nanograms per litre to make it entirely clear that this is a high sensitivity assay. This means that whereas previously you might have seen a troponin result of, say, 0.1, this would now be 100, so 100 nanograms per litre. If you think about this, all we're talking about here is the fact that we're progressively moving from where we were originally, where we were well clear of the reference interval. We've made assays more and more sensitive. We're now, a lot of the assays out there are available, which are available, can measure in the top end of the range. Most of them now are measuring in more or less into the midpoint, and there are assays around which are very close to being able to measure 100% normals. Why does this matter? It matters because of the ability to measure reliably and repeatably. This graph just shows you what would happen if you had, this is a value of 40, which is a normal value for one of the troponin I assays, showing what would happen if you were measuring the 20% imprecision. That means effectively you would be measuring a value, if you're on repeat measurement, go somewhere from 56 to 34. As your assay gets more and more precise, the range of normality tightens up. And this does actually translate into real clinical benefit. What are the benefits of high sensitivity troponin assays? Well, they've got two aspects. One is analytical and the other is clinical. Analytical benefit is I've alluded to in terms of the tightening up of the reference range. This actually translates into less borderline results. This is a study done by Fred Apple in the States, where he has compared the two patients. On the grey at the top here is troponin measurement using a contemporary sensitive assay, and this using a high sensitivity assay. And what you see is that using the sensitive assay, the results are very tightly grouped, and they are all within the reference interval, whereas these numbers here are bouncing around the reference interval. And you might be thinking clinically, well, I'd send them home. Do I keep them? I'll probably keep them and do some testing later. It also influences what's called the reference change, or the delta value. We all talk about delta values because this is the way in which we diagnose a myocardial infarction. We want to see is, if we measure two sequential values, are they essentially the same, or are they going up? And if they're going up, then that implies that the patient is having an acute injury. And again, we see the same sort of graph for that. Talking about the normal range is that as we make our imprecision smaller, we're able to reliably measure small differences between consecutive samples. And this is obviously of great importance. If we weren't able to do that, we would have some concerns. So, what does this mean in terms of clinical benefit? What does this mean for Rick and his work, general work? Well, basically what it means is we can get the same results faster. We also have the option to use troponin in a different way. The first suggestion that was made was that instead of saying, well, we will see is the initial troponin above or below the 99th percentile, which is the way we've normally worked, we can actually say, let's measure a sample of troponin when we first see the patient, which we can now measure at a very low level and which we can measure reliably. And it's been suggested that if you are unable to detect troponin when the patient first presents, that this, in fact, identifies patients at very, very low risk. I would like to emphasize at this point that you are not actually detecting whether the patient has or hasn't had a myocardial infarction at this point. What you are saying is, if the troponin level is very, very low, then the probability of the patient having a myocardial infarction in the next 30 days is also very, very low indeed. So we're using it as a risk tool. This is just some data for a meta-analysis using a whole series of studies where they have measured the initial troponin below the limit of detection combined with the ECG, and they show really quite reliably that if you look at the initial troponin measurement here combined with the ECG, that you can detect and rule out a significant number of patients on first presentation. I'm sure Rick will like to talk about this a bit more. Other question is using different sample strategies or different decision points. Traditionally, we used to measure troponin on admission, and when it was first introduced, 10 to 12 hours from admission. This was then moved to admission and 6 to 8 hours. And the most recent guidance suggests that we can use 0 and 3 hours. And in fact, we may be able to do even more aggressive rule-out strategies. This is essentially the algorithm proposed by the European Society of Cardiology, which uses two components. First of all, they use the admission measurement, as I've just mentioned. Secondly, they talk about a measurement on admission, and they're using a 1 hour rule-out. A variety of strategies have been proposed, 0-1, 0-2, 0-3. And it would be actually quite interesting to discuss this with the attendees. the actual merits of whether they feel in reality they could in fact put a 0 and 1 hour strategy in place. Essentially, patients who have a very low troponin or whose troponin is relatively low and doesn't change over the 1 hour period are ruled out. Here are for the two assays which are looked at in this study. This is used as a rule out strategy for troponin T of 5, for the Abbott architect assay of 2. There are other values proposed, and then they use a delta which is very small. And this is why high precision is very important, because we are able to measure changes of 3 or less reliably, but only just. There have been a number of validation studies performed looking at this. It is interesting to note, though, that although the initial studies showed very, very good results with 100% sensitivity and 100% negative predictive value, subsequent follow-up studies suggest that sensitivity might not be quite as good, although the negative predictive value is high. And I think this reflects the fact that these initial studies were done by dedicated groups with a lot of experience, whereas when we look at the data, which when it's thrown more out to the real world, it doesn't work quite as well. So these are certainly very useful, but shouldn't be used on their own. So the residual questions are: can rule out algorithms be used on their own? No. Clinical assessment prior probability remains essential. And Rick's going to talk about risk scores, which I think takes this further. Secondly, can the analytical imprecision and routine clinical use support these algorithms? This is an area that still remains a matter of some debate. It certainly is possible to do this, and in our hospital we actually evaluated the analytical imprecision of the Roche assay, and we are of the opinion that it is actually possible to use these algorithms, but Peter Kavsak has suggested that this might not be quite the case all the time. So rapid rule-out algorithms do appear to be clinically effective, and the use of an admission and serial measurement algorithm appears to be the most promising approach, but this must be combined with clinical assessment of the patient. I'm pleased to tell both Rick and Aleem that they're not going to be out of a job, because we do need clinicians to look at the patients. We can't do it all with scans and lab tests. I think one thing which is very important, and I would encourage people to push for, is that data to date is observational. And really, you do need some randomized controlled trials. And if you are going to put into place a rapid rule-out algorithm of this type, it may or may not be entirely appropriate for your population. And what I have been trying to encourage people to do, I'm doing this locally, and would encourage anybody who's watching this webinar, if you're going to put in a rapid rule-out protocol, make sure you have a baseline first of how many people that you are sending home and their outcomes. Then I would suggest you do a phased introduction, in that if you elect for, say, a 0-2 hour, that for a period of time you do 0, 2 and 3 hours, and then you check that your 2 hour results, your 0-2 hour results, are equivalent to your 0-3 hour results, or conversely if you're doing a 0-1 hour, before you actually go over it full time. Because though I think the results and the data presented to date is good, we are not absolutely certain yet, and it is going to depend on local factors as well. And for those of you that are interested, yes, I did take the pictures of the shark.
Brilliant, thanks so much. Sue, would you like to introduce our next speaker?
Yes, thanks, Carla. So now we're going to hand over to Professor Rick Boddy, who's Professor of Emergency Medicine at Central Manchester Foundation Trust, and he's an honorary consultant in emergency medicine, Director of Manchester Diagnostics and Technology Accelerator. And Rick's going to tell us about his work in Greater Manchester and the development and validation of the Manchester Acute Coronary Syndromes prediction model. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks very much, Sue, and thanks, Paul. Can you see my screen okay there?
Yep.
Great, okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a few tips. I'm going to share a few top tips about how you can develop your own rapid rule out pathway. We've been doing some work in Greater Manchester with Health Innovation Manchester for a little while now to implement rapid rule out pathways across the region. So I'm going to share the lessons that I've learned from that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly what we've done. So just first of all, I'm going to hammer home the importance of this for the emergency department. That's where I work. This chest pain is a huge burden on our services. 1.3 million attendances occur at the emergency departments across England and Wales every year for patients with a primary complaint of chest pain. And around 350,000 of those patients are admitted to hospital as an emergency. So that's one of the most common reasons for emergency hospital admission. And amazingly, most of those patients don't even need to be in a hospital, because only around 12 or 13% of the patients who are admitted for investigations actually have the condition we were worried about, an acute myocardial infarction. And the vast majority of the rest could have been reassured and allowed to go home very safely because they have a completely non-threatening clinical condition. The only problem was that we weren't sure that they didn't have an acute MI at the time they arrived. So getting this right could really help to unburden our emergency departments and our hospitals. So here are my top tips. I'll give you 3 steps really to designing your chest pain pathway. And so go through each of these. I'm going to go through them with you. The first step is to gather your team and your information. The second step is to decide how you're going to act based on the results of your first troponin test. And the third step is to decide what you're going to make decisions about based on the results of your second troponin test. 3 easy things. And essentially, there's a series of different boxes off the shelf and put into place for each of these things. And you can design your pathway according to your local needs. So let's just go through those things. So the first step, gather information, build your team. So get the stakeholders all together. You're going to need your staff from the emergency department to get together on this. You're going to need acute physicians. You're going to need your lab, cardiologists, and also you're going to need informatics, I'd say, because most of us use electronic patient records nowadays, and it's really important that we make this work alongside what we're already doing, especially because you want to collect some data, as Paul has mentioned. You then want to decide or to gather the information about what you're currently doing right now. So describe your current process, which sounds simple, but you do need to do a bit of work on this. You need to find out what troponin assay you're using, what cutoffs people are using to make decisions, what we say that we're using and what's being used in practice might not be the same thing. What decision aids you might be using to support your pathway. So are you using the TIMI score, the heart score, the TMAC score, etc. And then where are you sending patients? So do you have somewhere where low risk patients can go to, an ambulatory environment, or are they all going to acute medicine? Who's going to cardiology, and so on? The last step within this one is to look at what the guidelines tell us we ought to be doing. So NICE has guidance on high sensitivity troponin testing, DG15, as Sue's mentioned. We have the clinical guideline 95, CG95. There's the European Society of Cardiology guidelines, and the International Federation for Clinical Chemistry has some nice resources about what you should be doing with your troponin assay. So if you Google IFCC high sensitive troponin, you'll get a series of tables which tell you what cutoffs you should be using for your troponin assay. Have a look at those, and then you can see what the standards should be and make sure that your new pathway is designed in accordance with them. Then we get on to step 2 and decide what you're going to do when your clinicians see the results of the first troponin test. So there are going to be different options for patients. Are you going to allow some patients to go home? Let's see if I can use a pointer here. Are you going to send some patients home after a single test? Because as Paul has mentioned, you might be able to do that. In fact, the evidence suggests that we can do that with high accuracy now. So what are the criteria going to be, and how are we going to make that happen? So you could use the TMAC score, the heart score, or you could just use very low troponin concentrations to decide that patients can go home. On the other side, you've got patients who we know are very high risk, and we can identify that immediately following the first troponin test. So we could do that either because they've got a very high troponin result, or because a decision aid tells you that the patient is high risk, and there may be some overlap between those things. And then we're going to decide in the middle, what are we going to do with the rest of the patients? So Classically, this is called the observation zone, but I've divided that into two here, and I think this is really crucial. You could potentially identify a low-risk group who still need a second test, but don't need a hospital bed and all that goes with it and all the expense that incurs. So you can find this low-risk group for ambulatory care and a moderate risk group who could go to acute medicine and may need a hospital bed because you'll need to do a bit more workup even after the troponin tests. And here are the options. You could use a decision aid to do that, like T-masks. You could use the heart score, or again, you could decide on some criteria with your troponin to create a kind of division in your observation zone. Let's just stop that spotlight and move on. So I mentioned here about the importance of that observation zone, stratifying it into two, and I'd just like to share with you what we do in Greater Manchester. And I think this has really been key to our success at my hospital. We have created an ambulatory care unit, which was designed actually to support our chest pain pathway initially, but it's been broadened since then because it's been quite successful. This is our ward area, and we took out the beds, put in some chairs. We can fit more patients in. They don't get into their pyjamas, they stay in their clothes, and we don't over-medicalise the situation. So there's an understanding that if the second blood test is normal, which it is 95% of the time or more, then the patient will go home. And this makes for a very efficient service, much more efficient than sending the patient to an inpatient bed where they do feel medicalised and they do expect that they're staying overnight, and so do the staff. So I think that's been key to our success. Step 3, how are you going to change things based on the results of your second troponin test? So here you've got some choices. The first choice is when you're going to take the second troponin test. So Paul has mentioned we could do that at 1 hour, we could do it at 2 hours, we could do it at 3 hours. Now have a look at the evidence for your particular troponin assay, have a look at the different algorithms, and have a think about what suits your local processes. We don't use a 1 hour algorithm in Manchester, simply because it's very hard for the staff to take 2 blood tests an hour apart in an emergency department that's as crowded as ours. So it actually makes more sense to take the very low risk patients away to the ambulatory care environment. They have their second test currently at 3 hours, and then we make the decision in a much more relaxed environment, and it's very efficient. But the 1 hour protocol may be better for you. So think about who's going to take it, where they're going to do it, and how the result of the first test is going to affect the second test. Because of course, if you do the 1 hour protocol, you may not have the result before you take that second test, which means you may not be ruling patients out after one test after all. Step 3, that's thinking about the second troponin test, other questions. So you've got 3 groups here. You're going to rule out some patients. So think about who's going to review them, what follow-up you might arrange for patients, because some of them may need to still go to the rapid access chest pain clinic. What information should you give to the patients? In the rule-in zone, we know these patients are high risk, but we're going to have to think about, well, what are we going to do with that information? How are we going to use that information that we've got much earlier now to the patient's pathway? Are we going to get early angiography? Are we going to get early imaging for these patients? And then in the observation zone, if after 2 troponin tests, 1 to 3 hours apart, you've still not quite decided whether this is an acute MI or not, what are you going to do next? Is your sort of rescue troponin test going to be at 6 hours, or are you going to do imaging in all of those patients like a CTCA? And then, of course, once you've got through those 3 phases, you've still got some work to do. I should mention, this is all in the NICE adoption toolkit. You can find more detail on it there. But you should remember that you're going to have to do a lot of training with all of the stakeholders, make it easy to follow your pathway, and you're going to have to evaluate it to see whether it's actually working and whether you're using the best possible way for your patient population. So I'd quickly like to share with you what we're doing in Greater Manchester called the GN-TMACS project. So we developed a decision aid in Manchester through our research called TMACS, which combines information from the patient's history with the ECG and the troponin, and then uses that with a simple computer model to calculate the probability of an acute coronary syndrome for each patient. We then stratify patients into those 4 groups that I mentioned earlier: rule out, ambulatory care, acute medicine, and rule in, or cardiology. There are 7 things in TMACS, 7 parameters that we found to be independently predictive. You simply just enter them into a computer, and the computer spits out the probability, tells a clinician what to do. Here's some of the evidence from a recent validation study. Here you can see 4 decision aids compared: TMACS, heart, TIMI and EDAX, all of which are designed for use in the emergency department population with chest pain. On the y-axis, we've got the percentage of patients with an acute MI in each risk group, and here we've got the risk groups. So Tmax, you can see, was very efficient at rule out, well, very accurate, sorry, and very efficient. 47% of patients could be ruled out with one blood test, and we ruled in a lot, so over 80% ruled in while risk stratifying. You can see that it did better than the heart score for rule out, did better than the others, in fact, and was the strongest for rule in as well, and level with EDAX for efficiency. So on the basis of our evidence, we went ahead and implemented that. We've implemented a computer pathway. So as I say, you double click an icon on the desktop of the computer in the emergency department, you enter your data, and the computer calculates a probability, tells you what to do, tells you how to treat the patient, tells you if imaging is indicated, so it pushes information to the clinician. We treated 4,000 patients in the first 18 months, and we could see that having used that, we collected all of the data electronically, so it makes evaluation very easy. Almost 2/3 could now avoid hospital admission, whereas prior to that, when we last looked at the data before implementation, 85% were being admitted to acute medicine. So it's a real turnaround. And because we've got the data at 3 hours, as Paul suggested, everybody had a 3-hour test. We can tell that it was very sensitive for an acute MI, 98.7%. And by that we mean that they have a late troponin rise above the 99th percentile. So some of these were probably not true type 1 MIs, but we were liberal in our definition. So we could trust the accuracy of this, and we knew it was working efficiently. Here we can see length of stay in our risk groups. So we can see in the very low and low risk groups, patients are invariably going home on the same day. Some of them span midnight or stay 1 day, and a very small proportion stay longer than that. So 96.5% of our low risk patients discharged within 24 hours. So that's all I want to say. To finish, I'd like to say 3 things. You need to get to work to design your chest pain pathway. You could do that by yourself. You could get the NHSE resources, the NICE adoption toolkit. They're all there online and they're very helpful. You should use them. If you'd like, you can get in touch with me. We can share our learning from Health Innovation Manchester and what we've been doing. Also, I should mention that for this informatics requirement, we've realised that now anything that calculates or pushes recommendations to clinicians is technically a medical device. And pretty soon, we're going to have to get those CE marked, and the requirements are quite stringent. So you may need a company to help you to develop this informatics solution. We identified one in Greater Manchester called Cambio, and we're working with them to make sure that our clinical decision support system, which is so crucial to making these things work, is fully compliant with the medical device regulations. Thank you very much. So I'm handing back now to...
Lovely, thanks very much, Vic. And also for the people that have joined us later, don't forget that you can type in the question and answers. There's going to be time at the end of all of our panellists today to chat to. So Sue, I'll hand over to you to introduce Aleem.
Aintree and Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital. He's also first author on the 2017 Macros study, which is the Mersey acute coronary syndrome rule-out study. And Aleem and his team also developed the Liverpool acute chest pain proforma that's used as an example in the NICE adoption resource toolkit. So handing over to Aleem now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. I'm just trying to get my slides up. Carla, can you advance my slides, please?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's great to be in such illustrious company. I've got a lot to say, a lot of slides, so I'm going to try to be quick, so excuse me. I just have to, actually, 1 second. If you can come to the first slide, Carla. Just come to the first slide. Yeah, there. There's a lot of partners that helped us along our journey. And before, in case I forget, I put them in the first slide. And in particular, industry and government bodies and healthcare institutes. I want to particularly mention Liverpool University Hospital and in particular Aintree, which gives money via Dragon's Den Innovation Fund. It was great fun presenting there and competing. Also Bayer funded the validation of our work. NHS Digital were crucial because I think one of the things I want to stress is understanding and achieving common definitions of what is a heart attack is not always easy. And what in these studies, many of these studies that have been actually described today, there are different definitions of a heart attack and how they are derived. And we wanted to do something that almost gold standard so people could understand what we meant when we said an individual had a heart attack, because that feeds into all your sensitivity and negative predictive values. Next slide, please. And obviously very grateful to Liverpool Clinical Laboratories and Lisa and also Randox who helped us with the quality control at the very low values that Paul spoke about, how to achieve that delta 3 or to come close to that, because that, on the face of it, it seems extremely challenging. And whenever you develop a program like this, I like to think of a virtuous circle where you need collaboration from a number of groups, and you need to develop a number of protocols, and you need to involve a number of individuals. And we have had citywide service collaboration via the CCG. There's obviously the developments, high sensitive troponin. We have evidence in our local population, and we are trying to present this work as we go along. Next slide. So this is, I think Rick's already demonstrated the magnitude of this problem. I don't need to reiterate that. We're not talking about mortality here. We're talking about healthcare delivery. There's no evidence that high sensitive troponins improve mortality. We want to make our services efficient. We want to reduce the burden on healthcare institutions. And by that manner, we can help our patients. Many of them don't need to stay in hospital. But what I realized when I started out in this project, a lot of individuals, including myself, are scarred by missed MIs, and the literature is replete with that in the 80s, 90s, and even in the 2000s. So we have to overcome that problem. Next slide. Next slide, Carla. Yeah. So previous slide. Yeah. It's not always so easy to recognize an MI. I mean, obviously, this picture demonstrates a very classical symptom, but we know there's groups, especially females, diabetics, elderly, we don't have the same symptoms, and ACS can be missed. Now, we spoke about rise or fall in troponin. I'm going to show a chart where that can be challenging. It can be really challenging. We've had debates, and I think Paul will concur. There's been debates about what is a rise or a fall and the magnitude of that and how that feeds into the sensitivity of a myocardial infarction. What about when there's uncertainty? I know working in the cath lab, at least 20 or 30% of non-STEMIs are not true non-STEMIs. But at the same time, we cannot rule out as non-STEMI simply by coronary angiography. Sometimes we do need intracoronary imaging. Next slide. So this is part of the dilemma. On the right, we've got an ECG, which shows anterolateral ST depression, and there's elevation in AVR, quite classical ECG changes. But actually, in non-STEMI population, only 1 in 5 have a demonstrable clear abnormality on ECG. So the ECG is sometimes a faux ami. It doesn't really help us that much all the time. Sometimes it's very clear. And obviously there's other conditions, and I've presented to myocarditis and heart failure, and we're looking at the magnitude of rise to try to separate out the conditions. Next. Next. Yes, so here's an illustration of a small and a large heart attack with corresponding troponin rises. And you can see at the top, if you transect the peak and you check another troponin in 6 hours, the troponin can be identical. So these are some traps for the unwary. Next, there should be another annotation. Yes, and this the actual lines show a very early taking a troponin very early in a small heart attack. And so our deltas may well not play out there. And similarly, if someone presents 3 days after a heart attack with pericarditis pain and they are below the 99th percentile, we feel that we can rule out a heart attack, but actually the MI happened 3 days earlier. So these are some traps for the wary: early versus late presentation, infarct size, perfusion. Just to emphasize Paul's point, the history and clinical examination are vital, and none of these algorithms, none of these risk scores, none of these charts of delta troponins can never take that away. And I've tried to illustrate that. Next. This is an optical coherence tomography in a young man with hypercholesterolemia, only 29 years old, and we didn't have a major troponin rise because he presented late. But in actual fact, I don't have that mouse, and Carla, I'm not sure you can show it, but this demonstrates from around about 6 o'clock to 11 o'clock that there's plaque rupture and there is intramural hematoma, disturbing the architecture of the vessel, confirming that this young man actually did sustain a myocardial infarction. We don't treat it any differently because the lumen preserved, but it's very important to achieve the diagnosis. Next. And this is some of the work that we did do in our initial cohort study, 1,642 consecutive patients. We wanted to look at a range of risk scores and rules on a single presentation troponin. And what we found was, just like my colleagues have illustrated, that troponin below the limit of detection and a non-ischemic ECG revealed a negative predictive value of 99.7% of patients, ruling out 36.9%. But also the heart score less than 3 was also a player, with a negative predictive value of 99.5%. Next. But that ruled out 52% allowing discharge. Obviously, a lot of these studies, like this one, was a virtual study. So we didn't actually action. We actually just put these rules in place and try to understand what would have happened. And I think we have to move on to actual implementation and RCTs, as Paul has indicated. Next. So this is what we produced on the basis of this. Next, we actually did want to incorporate this high sensitive troponin less than 5 and a non-ischemic ECG. There's a big rule, a page of rules that came with this. We used delta values from a number of studies by Giannizzi from Heidelberg to look at what we can say is a likely MI with a delta of over 7 nanograms. We can shift that now that we've got further data, and ruling was greater than 52, but we stressed the importance of clinical examination. Next, so we implemented this in Liverpool hospitals in 2016, and just to reiterate, the way we actually undertook our data analysis was quite specific. Our derivation cohort of 1,642 from a single trust. In 2018, we did the validation of our work, 1,376 consecutive patients at 2 hospitals. We worked with NHS England and NHS Digital after an excruciating, a long time in trying to achieve something called confidential advisory group by a Home Office appointed group to allow us access to any patient's data in any hospital in England where they had a whole list of codes, including chest pain, other ischemic heart disease, MI codes, unstable angina, any possible presentation with MI. A whole team went through, retrieved these records, went through, and for any individual whose biomarker was above the 99th percentile, we undertook an independent, blinded adjudication of a myocardial infarction, separated into type 1 and type 2 MI, by experienced clinicians using the third universal definition. Every single index presentation who had a troponin above the 99th percentile also underwent this process. We feel that gives us some commonality of definition. And we also looked at revascularization, emergency and urgent revascularization, and all-cause death up to 6 weeks and at 1 year. Next slide. So we wanted to show the good, the bad, the ugly. We just wanted to try to get to the truth as to what was happening, because there was a great deal of angst, anxiety about decision making. I felt, speaking to clinicians who weren't cardiologists. We try to. I'm a young colleague of mine called Freddie Frost. Introduced this chest pain performer so that we could document actual key features on history to separate into low, moderate, and high suspicion. We gave some advice about non-ACS differential diagnoses as well, but this was used, I have to say, variably and in Aintree Hospital and not so much in the Royal. Next. It helped us with data collection. Next slide. This is some of our results separated into 2011 and 2018 data. We can see that over the years, a younger population is actually coming into hospital. Percentage of males has stayed the same. When you look at 3 risk factors, the burden of disease is less. And this is a trend that's been picked up epidemiologically as well. Next. Professor Collinson's point is very well made. You have to look at your own population because your sensitivity depends on the prevalence of the disease. And even though you can get a very good negative predictive value, I think sensitivity above 98% is important. And look what's happened to the prevalence of disease. We are testing troponins on less sick individuals, and this will affect our figures. In 2011, 11.9% had an adjudicated diagnosis of type 1 or 2 AMI. In 2018, it's only 6%. And the MACE rate up to 6 weeks is 13.9% in 2011 and 7.7% in 2018. Next. And this is a key slide. What we done to improve upon the percentage discharge from A&E, and our rule out previous algorithm, individuals were checking troponin at 0. Sometimes they were waiting till 6 hours of chest pain, and then they were repeating it at 6 and 12 hours. And so many patients were admitted. Only 27% were discharged. We've got that up to 56%. So hopefully we'll reach our sequent targets. So that's a rise of 29%. Next slide, next annotation. So 29% increase. That is 2,320 admissions saved, which is at least £600,000 to the local health economy for an admission. And previously patients were staying in for several days. So that's a very minimal figure. And that figure could be closer to 1 million. Next. So what about safety? Well, we can discharge, but we have to understand, is there a price for safety? And I think a lot of individuals would want to see this data. We had no access so no one could interfere with this data. This was centrally coordinated, locked down, password protected, sent over to statisticians and files with CRN numbers. So this is the reality. In 2011, we missed 0.7% of patients with an adjudicated type 1 or type 2 MI. And up to 6 weeks, it was the same. There was no one else. 2018, we missed 0.3% of patients who were discharged with a type 1 or type 2 MI, and up to 6 weeks, that was 0.4%. I want to just tell you very briefly about these patients that were adjudicated. Both these patients in 2018, where the diagnosis of MI was missed, were type 2 MIs with atrial arrhythmias with troponin rise causing chest pain. The one patient who had, a young patient who had an MI at 5 weeks after discharge with low risk situation, actually took I don't, how can I describe it, a sizable quantity of amphetamines and sustained an ST elevation myocardial infarction. So really, we're talking about these cases being missed, and actually, for certainly the two type 2 MIs, no harm accruing as a consequence to these missed diagnoses. Next slide. This is just some of the bar charts to show you actually what happened. We can see that we are discharging people a lot earlier if we take the totality of their discharge. Next. This is a slightly disappointing data, no matter how much I stress to try to take troponin at presentation. Even in 2018, we can see that the peak is actually between 1 and 2 hours, and our median time to troponin check was 1.5 hours. And hopefully we can talk about that. How can we improve our systems to improve in that? But it is an improvement on 2011, but really some of the rules are that we should be checking troponins within 1 hour. We should check an ECG within 10 hours of suspected ACS, and the lab should have a turnaround of their troponin of between 1 hour from sample draw to the results being available to clinicians. Next slide. Again, this is more encouraging. We've moved the second troponin from 6 hours, 7 hours or beyond to a peak of 3 hours as we intended. Next. These are some some box plots demonstrating essentially it's the same data. Presentation to first troponin. We have come down, and we've come down also in our times for the second troponin. Next. Interestingly, if we look at only the 27 and the 56, 27 and the 56% of 58% of patients discharged, we haven't reduced the time that much from about 6.5 hours to 5.5 hours. And we need to improve our efficiency in actually undertaking that. Obviously, we've discharged a lot more without admission. Box plot, time to presentation to discharge. This, if we take the totality of everyone, we've reduced the median stay in hospital with us in A&E or in the ward from 16 hours 9 minutes to 9 hours and 7 minutes. When we understand the numbers coming through the door, this is a really, really great benefit to healthcare institutions. Next. This is time to ECG. We're doing fairly well okay there. I have to say, next slide, I have to say that we have to be very careful with data. When we looked at the times of discharge and we drew up the times from audit departments in the hospitals, they weren't the real true times, because to escape the 4-hour penalty, trusts were moving patients from the A&E to ambulatory daycare wards, which were not classed as admissions, but the times of discharge were taken at the time that they left A&E, and we had to correct all that. We feel our data is robust, and so I think it's very important to try to get a true picture to understand the workings of one's local environment. Next slide. So just to wrap up, I think high-sense troponins have really improved things in terms of rule out. We can discharge a lot more. We can do it safely. And I hope I've demonstrated to everyone through a very exhaustive, rigorous process that we can do it safely. And there's no reason to fear. If we take a good history, we look at the ECG, we check the troponins, and we use these fairly robust, evidence-based methods to rule out, even with just a single troponin, we can improve. And we need to, but we have to improve A&E performance as well collectively. Perhaps we need to invest in phlebotomists to try to take these troponins earlier. We are very pleased with what Paul said. We are moving to a pragmatic RCT where we're going to hopefully test 1 hour versus a 3 hour protocol, and we're going to keep that safety window there. We need to understand the downstream consequences, and some of our juniors are working on that in terms of whether there's going to be a price to pay in terms of CT scans being increased in terms of demand. And we also have to focus a lot better in ruling. And we've just published in BMJ one algorithm about ruling. And I think that also is important, especially where we work in an environment where we have a single site tertiary revascularization center and a whole satellite of hospitals that don't have that facility. Next slide. And I'll just take any questions. This isn't quite as dramatic as Paul's shark, but this is a picture of us actually cycling to Paris. And I would encourage everyone to take up physical exercise. I've struggled with the stress and too many donuts and coffee, and this was an exhilarating experience. Thanks for your attention. I'm sorry I've gone just over time.
No, that was great. I think timing's perfect. So we'd like to welcome our participants to ask questions. You can use the Q&A, or if you can see online, you'll be able to raise your hand, and then I can actually unmute you if you've got something that you would like to discuss and ask. So yeah, I'm just going to
Carly, can you go back to your first slide with the...
Yeah, I'm just going to unmute Richard, and I'm going to unmute Paul as well. That video. Yeah. So, yeah. If anyone would like to...
Can I just make a little...
Absolutely, Paul, yeah.
I'm going to take Aleem to task on his troponitis. There's no such thing as troponitis. if your wall of your house is falling down, you don't say you have brickitis. You get the builder in. I think it's a misnomer, and it's a very bad misnomer. Troponin is an exquisitely sensitive test for cardiac damage, but what people haven't quite got their head around is that not all cardiac damage is a myocardial infarction. And the lovely thing about it is that if your troponin is not elevated above the 99th percentile, or better still, if it's really, really low, you have an excellent prognosis. And this is actually really important, because for the emergency department, the troponin is probably the best rule-out test that's ever been invented, because not only does it rule out myocardial infarction, but in fact, if your troponin's not up, you almost don't have anything else. And if you come in and you've got a pneumonia and your troponin's up, you will do badly. If you've been bitten by a snake and your troponin's up, you will do badly. And it even transpires if you've got COVID and your troponin's up, you will do badly. This is a very important thing to remember. It is a fantastically useful test. You just have to remember that you interpret it in the clinical context. And my personal beef is that I think that the invention of type 2 myocardial infarction was a mistake, because basically people have these patients that they think, oh, it's a type 2 MI. Oh, what do I do with them now?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Can I respond to that, Carla? Yeah. Am I on?
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. I think that's absolutely true. I don't disagree with that. I think all I would say is that if you're a clinician and you've worked through the transition from troponins to high sensitive troponins, and that you are being referred sometimes 10 or 15 referrals a day, simply because individuals feel in ITUs and other departments that the troponin elevation means that they should start ticagrelor and aspirin and low molecular weight heparin. And there is a whole wide array of pathologies that lead to myocyte necrosis, and it's not always ischemia. And I think that term is that misnomer has taken hold in our practice because of this frustration of increased workload and occasional misinterpretation. So I accept what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, so we have got a question. I'm just going to unmute your mic. Hello, Mike. Are you okay to speak?
Yes. Hi, it's Mike Fisher here, also from Liverpool, one of Aleem's colleagues. I think the thing that Paul just alluded to there is really important, because, you know, I think while he's quite right that there's no such thing as troponinitis in the sense that this is irrelevant and we can ignore it, the real problem here is that, as he said, that people don't make the distinction between a myocardial infarction and a myocardial injury as it's currently defined. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because the thing is that it's actually possible to have some genuine detectable infarction of the myocardium without that being due to an acute coronary syndrome. And the real problem here is that, of course, in practical terms and in terms of trying to improve people's prognosis, what you actually want to do, of course, is treat the pathology correctly. And as Paul himself pointed out, you can have a raised troponin with pneumonia. And as a risk stratification tool, the troponin is very useful. But the difficulty is that people confuse using troponin as a risk stratification tool and using it as a diagnostic tool. And so, you know, to take that example, you don't treat a pneumonia with aspirin, ticagrelor, and low molecular weight heparin and a PCI. You treat it with antibiotics if it's a bacterial pneumonia. And the difficulty that we have in practical terms is that those distinctions are completely lost on a lot of clinicians. And as Aleem has said, the instant response to any raised troponin is to immediately turn off the brain and to prescribe extremely powerful anticoagulants, which in fact, from different work that Aleem has done, we know can be positively harmful.
I think that is an excellent point. One important message, though, which I think needs to get out to colleagues, is that if you have a single troponin that's elevated, that means that you need to think. But what you think is, I need to do a second one. And people quite frequently don't do that, because if you have an elevated troponin, but it's a sustained elevation, it means there's something going on, but you can rule out an acute injury. And people have a perception that you actually need to intervene with ticagrelor and aspirin, et cetera, immediately, whereas in fact, this is not true.
Yeah, I agree, Paul, completely. Am I unmuted? I don't know if you can hear me.
No, we can.
Great. Okay. Yeah, and I think one of the problems in the emergency department, where we've got high volumes, is that we get a large amount of junior staff treating patients, and they come through with quite high throughput, so small, short placements, and they're expected to know an awful lot about a wide variety of presentations. So it's not surprising that they misunderstand this area fairly commonly. I think what we've got to do when we implement our rapid rule-out pathways is actually try and find a way of pushing the guidelines that we want them to follow to them, to make it very easy for them to work in accordance with what we recommend. So that's why I was emphasising the importance of informatics in my talk, where we can use clinical decision support systems to actually push the guidelines to them. When you have quite complicated guidelines, and I've seen many across the country, some of them are, you know, as many as 18 pages long. It's actually impossible for the junior staff to digest all of that and retain it for every patient that they treat. So what you really want to do is have a system by which, when they treat a patient, they enter the information that the computer needs to know and then spit out the recommendations to them. And of course, as Mike has just really nicely emphasised, we need to be sure to point out that they need to do some thinking around it, that it's not just the numbers that matter, it's the clinical situation and the clinical judgments around what's actually going on with that patient.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. If I could just add that when I spoke to colleagues of mine in A&E, Rick and others, just to ask them about what they feel about some of the chest pain performa that we produced, which wasn't received universally, if I'm being very honest. I think one of the problems that they cited was that a lot of junior doctors feel their job is done when they've ruled out ACS. So looking at the converse of an elevated troponin, if they've ruled out ACS, they feel that's it. And it's really to press on individuals also to have some support mechanism to look at the kind of the differential diagnosis of non-ACS's work, so that we actually, of course, reassure in discharge, but in a certain proportion of patients, we pick up the diagnosis as well, such as, you know, a pulmonary embolism or pneumothorax even, or, you know, pancreatitis. And so I think that I don't know how you feel, Rick, about that's something that I found challenging to try to grapple with, to try to when I'm speaking to junior doctors who variably work in A&E, and they keep changing every 6 months, to how to reinforce that, to you know, go back to the basics and take a history and use all these decision tools as an aid, but not as the be-all and end-all of actual work.
Yeah, really good point. And one of the most dissatisfying things, I think, for patients is when they're told, it's not your heart, you can go home. And that's the end of the consultation. No thought about what might have caused the symptoms and all the worry that went along with it and how they might stay healthy and so on in the future. We're doing work in Manchester, which is taking a pause because of the pandemic, unfortunately, but we're doing some work with patients and clinicians, including all grades or professions of clinician in the hospital, and GPs as well, to develop or co-produce some information that might allow us to inform patients about their ongoing risk and ways that they can stay healthy. Apparently we do that really badly. And then at the end of that, what we hope is that we'll be able to engage our patients in a kind of shared decision-making process, not just saying black and white, this is not your heart, because there's always a little bit of uncertainty that remains in any condition when we discharge patients. So actually communicating the risks to patients in a quantitative way, engaging them in the decision-making process about what we do from here, talking about what else might have caused the symptoms, and also ways that they might stay healthy, because these patients are actually at high risk of cardiovascular disease, even if they're not having an acute MI. We know that the cardiovascular prognosis of patients with chest pain presenting to an ED who don't have an MI is actually worse than the general population. So there might be a really good teachable moment for us there, where we can identify, well, actually you do smoke, and there's something we could do about that. You don't, is there anything we could do to improve your exercise, and other interventions that we could actually do and make a difference for the patients, rather than simply just saying it's not your heart, you can go home.
I'm just gonna I'm just going to take a moment, and maybe I think you guys are starting to get to some of this culture work that we want to also make sure we address. And so I'll just introduce myself to everybody who's on the call, and maybe run through a couple of my slides about what's next for this group, next steps, and then sort of we can take any final questions, but we're doing great on time. So hi, everybody. I'm Jen Cohan. I'm the head of the Coaching Academy here at the Innovation Agency, and our team is all about supporting teams to collaborate around innovation and implementation. And so much of our work is really around the culture of these changes, and working with all the stakeholders in the system who are navigating some really complex decision-making and pathways. And so I'm just gonna go through a couple of slides, and it will just take me a minute, but some of you who are on the call might be wondering sort of what's next and where we go from here. So here we go. Can you see my slides then?
Yep.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, let's see here, we'll just get that going. Oh, did it go black?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. It's just transitioning here, I think. I'll escape, maybe. There we go. That's fine. Okay, there we go. Okay. So I think one of the things I'm thinking of, do you see the iceberg now? Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Got nervous there. So, you know, and this goes, all three of you really have talked about this in that what we see, you know, you've got your data, we've got, we know when tests are given, we try to track when tests are given, that kind of thing. So that's the surface bit of observable, of what's actually happened. I wrote down, somebody has said, I think Aleem, it was you who said data is observational. You know, and I think that's really, really powerful. So what we try to do through a coaching approach, and I'll talk about that in a second, is really get to that underneath the surface bit. What are the patterns of behavior? What are the trends that we're noticing over time? How does that help us uncover where there might be hiccups or obstacles to speeding up the testing, getting labs back more quickly, that kind of thing. But even underneath that, we go further into what are the structural forces at play. So for me, when I see the difference between the chairs and the beds, right? Like these are some of those really systematic structural elements that we might have more control over than we think. And that gets to this even further bit underneath the mental models. And that's about, you know, what are the thinking models that we are just naturally tied to, that sometimes prevent us from looking at how can we do this differently? What might this look like if it were faster? What are some of the things we might see? So that's the approach that we sort of come to in the Coaching Academy, especially around systems thinking. And that's really what this, you know, a lot of this is how do we improve this whole system? So just for those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with coaching, I like to just give a quick analogy of the coach itself, like a bus to me from America. It's a thing that takes you from one place to another. Certainly my background is not clinical, but as a coach, my job is to help mediate sort of between where we are, either as teams and individuals, as a system, and help move us to the place that we'd like to be. So coaching is all about increasing capacity. It's all about mediating, being in the middle of the challenges that are occurring, moving folks from one place to the other. And what we do in the coaching sense is we try to ask the right questions, and get out of the way, but ask the right questions to help folks either specify their thinking, clarify their thinking, redirect, and just to sort of switch up your neural pathways a little bit and ask you to get out of your typical modes of thinking through dialogue. So that's where we come from. So regionally, and I know some of you might be familiar with this, but in the sense that, you know, today was supposed to be our face-to-face day. This is sort of an introduction in a way, but we like to use this Z model as, you know, folks who are joining pathway transformation, you know, very often we start with, we just don't know what we don't know. The more we raise awareness, so a lot of the data that we've seen today, a lot of the information that you have also brilliantly shared, that raises our awareness. Once we internalize that, hence the heart in the middle. It's not a cardiological reference, but I think it's appropriate. But once we sort of internalize that awareness, then we really move to action, and that's where we see behavior change in folks. Once that action takes place, then we practice it, it becomes familiar and becomes normal. So, you know, it's hard for us to imagine things we're doing now that we weren't doing 10 years ago. It's hard to imagine what we did before that. So our goal in this collaborative approach, and this is over time, today is just the beginning, is to really harness and optimize the existing expertise that we have in the community. I think everybody who's on the call right now, folks who are just listening in, you have great insights and knowledge about your sites and your experiences that we're hoping that we can all bring that learning together. We want to really just collaborate to explore what's working, what's not, what we can start doing, stop doing. And through that, our offer from the Coaching Academy is to really just support you as partners in that. And really, I think what we work on in our team, and we work with teams all over the system, from diabetes to women's and children's to GP practices, is to connect the culture and the procedural elements of your implementation and your data collection. So when we're talking about like the roles of the folks who are administering the assays, you know, what are the mental models that they're functioning from? How do we adapt our narrative to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page? So that's our approach. Here's a little bit about our method. I've used these slides before, and I just put a strike through to indicate really all that's changed now since we're moving this to a remote collaboration approach, is that through this, you know, all of us getting together right now and over the next several months, is we're bringing our stakeholders together. That's all of you, and that's everybody who wasn't able to join today, but who listens on a recording, or your colleagues who want to join in. We are setting up, we've got a NHS Futures site. So if you're not already on NHS Futures, it's a really, really great platform that, boy, has its usage jumped in the last couple of weeks. And so we're going to put all of our resources there. There will be a discussion board space. It'll be an interim space for in-between webinars. Instead of our face-to-face all-day workshops that we had planned throughout the year, right now we're just moving to a monthly webinar model. We're going to drive those webinars determined by what folks in the community need and want. And in the interim, we're going to offer some group coaching. So whether or not that's sites who want to get together, you know, say, hey, you're a little bit like us, perhaps we should work on this together. We can organize webinars like this, but where it's actually not a webinar, it's a Zoom meeting where everyone can get together and debrief and talk about their issues, and we can offer some coaching guidance for that. And then we're going to engage in that spread and adoption work. So this is just one big PDSA, one big cycle of continuous improvement, where we're going to return back and again to what we're discovering over the months that we work together about, again, setting those baselines. I think that's really, really key. Figuring out what it is we're going to investigate, looking at what does the implementation look like, reflecting together, sharing data, and then we'll sort of reflect on that over time. So finally, just my last little bit I wanted to share is that in the next week, you'll receive an invitation. If you've joined us, if you're listening to this later on a recording and you want to join us, just reach out, and we will invite you to join this space on NHS Futures, and there will be resource folders. We'll have all the slides that folks need, recordings. There will be a discussion board where if you want to start specific threads, you can. All of us at the Coaching Academy will sort of monitor those discussion boards. We'll have a calendar that's going to have links to all the future meetings and webinars. If you want to request coaching support, we have the capacity to do that now that we perhaps didn't a week ago, because all of our support is really moving to remote collaboration right now. We would love to do more of that with you online. So we can, if you're a specific team, just let us know and we can help coach you through some work. And then we're also going to post, as a wrap up to this, as we debrief this webinar, what are some recommended actions and some review for sharing for the next webinar. So if you're going to review what you're already doing, I know, I think as far as Rick's couple of steps that he recommended, that whole build your team and describe your current process, I think those are our two main tasks right now. And so what we'll do is on that future site, we're going to lay that out. What are we recommending? We would be happy then to jump on a call with you and do some stakeholder mapping, do some process mapping. And so that's sort of our offer. I think with that, I know we've got just a couple minutes to go, so I'm just going to turn it back over to Sue, our other panelists, and see if anybody else wants to contribute or has any questions.
Okay, hi Sue.
Yeah, hi, I'm here. Inviting any final questions to the audience, please, if you'd like to raise your hand.
I just want to say too, I'm really excited about the potential for doing this collaboration on a large scale. So I think that what we have learned from other teams in other disciplines is that the more we share with each other, the better things get really very quickly, and there's quite an urgency for that right now. So so I'm just really grateful to be part of this group.
Okay, Sue, we don't have any more questions.
Okay, thanks everybody. So once again, immense thank you to everybody and all our speakers today for giving their time, especially in the current situation. That was really high quality. And just to summarise, we've heard from Professor Paul Collinson about the biochemical and the cardiology perspective. He has insights into both. Rick's practical application of the risk stratification and Aleem's powerful data that shows safe discharge and some persuasive economic benefits as well. And then we've heard from Jen from our Coaching Academy about building the capacity to collaborate and share, and that there'll be lots of opportunity for connecting cultural models to this. And that there's more capacity to do more online collaborative sharing. So the overall message, I think, is that this is to undertake the whole clinical picture, bring this back to basic assessment principles and history taking, and treat the patient as a whole. So once again, thanks very much, and goodbye.
Goodbye.